Welcome. Hi, my name is Judy Twigg. I'm a professor in the political science department here at VCU. It's nice to see a couple of familiar faces. And we are privileged today to be joined by Professor Anthony Godfrey. And actually, we're not just privileged today to be joined by Ambassador Godfrey. We're privileged all semester because he's teaching a course for us that I'm sure a couple of you are taking. Ambassador Godfrey's career started with 12 years in the United States Navy. He then transitioned to be a career diplomat. He spent 30 years with the State Department in various positions, including 4 years at the United States Embassy in Moscow, where he was, among other things, the Deputy Chief of Mission. And in his last posting, he was ambassador to Serbia from 2019 to 2022. And we are here today to talk about Russia's war in Ukraine and just what on earth it is Russia was thinking when it got into this, what it's thinking now, and how we can disentangle what its motivations are. So with a group this size, I would love for this to be informal, if that's okay with you, Ambassador Godfrey. So feel free to interrupt, ask questions. My role here is to moderate. So I was saying earlier that I love this kind of event where I get to just do introductions and then just sit back and ask any questions that I want of someone like Ambassador Godfrey. But I hope you'll feel free to do the same so that we can have an interactive
But full disclosure, we have in Dr. Twigg an esteemed expert as well, and I'm going to take the opportunity to maybe kick a question or two back to you.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. So just briefly, although I'm sure everybody in the room is aware of this, just over a year ago, Russia launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. It took most people by surprise. There was a lot of hand-wringing about whether or not it was going to happen at the time. Most of us, I think, said it wouldn't. The Biden administration told us that it would, and they were right. The Ukrainians, I think, were living in denial for quite some time up until the time the invasion happened. But when it did, they displayed astonishing success on the battlefield and politically pushed Russia back from its initial successes. Russia almost took the capital. It was a scary period of time for quite a few weeks. But you can see on the map here that Russia has successfully taken a pretty good chunk of the eastern part of Ukraine. They continue to hold the Crimean Peninsula, which they illegally annexed in 2014. Last fall, Russia declared two of those provinces in the east, Luhansk and Donetsk, as new provinces belonging to Russia, again, illegal according to international law and not accepted as fact by most, the vast majority of countries in the world. And I'm simplifying here, over time the war has now evolved into a stalemate, something of a war of attrition, where you have brutal, almost World War I-esque battlefield conditions prevailing in the areas that you see shaded in purple. We're all holding our breath because it's expected that either or both sides will launch an offensive this spring. The Ukrainians are saying, sort of in the 8 weeks, give or take a few weeks time frame. They have the manpower to do it, the trained manpower to do it. They don't have the hardware that they need to do it, which raises questions about what we have contributed, the United States and the NATO alliance, what we've contributed or what we should be contributing to ensure Ukraine's success. So we'll talk today about how all this came about, how it's evolved, and particularly from the Russia perspective, what it is that's happening inside Russia and how Russia may evolve as a great power as a result of the decision that they made to get embroiled in this conflict. Which starts us with our big sort of opening question. What were they thinking?
Right, it's a great question. And we're never going to hear the answer from Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin himself. But we can speculate, and by this time we've already had an opportunity to analyze what was going on. First, Putin has always held in his mind the need to reassert Russia's dominance over what was called the near abroad for the longest time. Russia wants to reclaim its lost empire. Russia wants to assert dominance over not just the former Soviet republics, but wants to be able to influence the decisions that other countries in the region make, which in the view of every expert on international relations, and by the way, international law, is unlawful and illegal. So Russia has been thinking about this for the longest time, but hasn't been able to do it, hasn't had the capacity to do it. Russia, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, was something of a basket case in terms of management, in terms of economics, and militarily as well. So in the period before it reacquired the ability to assert its dominance, what it did was tried to keep its near abroad unstable, to keep things uneven, to prevent the countries of its neighborhood from making decisions which would allow them to move closer to the West or to make their own decisions about their own future. Russia did this in Georgia. Russia continues to do this in Moldova, and certainly has done it in Ukraine, in the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, and also, of course, in Crimea. But the decision to move ahead when they did, in my view, was because Russia recognized that its leverage was going away, and it was going away fast. What's Russia's leverage? Well, its ability to manage energy markets is a big one. Europe, Western Europe, is absolutely dependent on Russian energy, and continues to be so to this day. In particular, Germany has been dependent on Russian gas for the longest time. And ever since the horrible tragedy at the nuclear power plant in Japan, Germany's Greens essentially shut down Germany's nuclear industry, and the production of electricity has moved almost entirely to natural gas. But this has always been a transition. And as renewables become a more important part of Europe's energy mix, Russia's ability to dominate Europe becomes less. And that's absolutely one of the major factors that Putin was thinking about. Putin was also thinking that the West would respond the way we had responded before. That past response would predict future response. And that was a huge mistake. And thinking that because the West had responded fairly weakly with sanctions when Russia took parts of Georgia, when Russia asserted dominance over Donetsk and Luhansk, or part of Moldova, that would be the response that the West would do, would show in the future. It wasn't the case. You referred in your introduction, your very kind introduction, that the one thing that the Biden administration predicted accurately was that, yes, Russia is going to do this. One of the things that the administration did extraordinarily well, and represent a sea change from the way we engaged in previous conflicts like this, is that we found ways to share intelligence, actionable intelligence, with our allies, with the Ukrainians themselves, and we did this in such detail and so consistently that when we would go to our allies, they said, look, we've decided that we don't think this is going to happen. We know what you think, we know what you think, but we don't think it's going to happen. So when it happened, Germany in particular was, damn it, they were right, and now we have to respond. So the response that Putin got that shocked him was the sustained consensus by Western Europe that the invasion of Ukraine was illegal, was dangerous to Europe's security, and needed to be opposed as much as possible. So that's why then, and I think the why now factor, and one other thing that maybe I'd like to ask you about, is that within Russia, his leverage or his ability to respond was waning as well, and Putin saw that. Certainly, he didn't understand what was going on in his own country as well as he thought he did. The isolation of the pandemic and the weird way that Putin was isolated from absolutely everybody was one factor. But I think there are demographic factors that you've written about, and that might be interesting for folks to talk about. there are fewer Russians, and there are going to be even fewer going forward. Isn't that right?
And Putin's aware of this. They've been aware of this for a long time, but just very briefly, when the Soviet Union collapsed back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, people stopped having children, which is a natural response to tremendous political, social, societal upheaval. And that dramatically reduced number of babies born 20, 30 years ago is now translating into a dramatically reduced number of young couples who are of the right age to start having children, which means that you have this shrinking of Russia's population pyramid where there are just fewer children being born, and that is a factor that they have very little wiggle room to change. It's locked in because of this echo effect of the reduced cohort of people of childbearing age that had it start 20 or 30 years ago. The flip side of that coin, on the other side of the spectrum, is that, especially back in the 1990s, again, because of the upheaval of that post-Soviet collapse, life expectancy plunged. Adult male mortality, working age men in their 50s, even their 40s and their 30s, were dying at rates that are unprecedented for a society that wasn't at war from heart disease, stroke, largely because they were drinking themselves to death. And they've made some public health strides in getting a handle on that, but they still have adult male mortality rates that are incredibly high compared to European counterparts. So that means that overall you have a Russian population that's shrinking, which means fewer able-bodied people to be in your workforce, fewer men of conscription age, of an age to get out there and be in the trenches fighting the kind of land war that Russia's fighting. And this is a demographic collapse that will continue to evolve over time. So Putin may have decided, I need to do this before my manpower capacity to pull it off erodes even more.
I think that's really an important factor, and he had to have been thinking about this because, like you said, they did they started up some policies to incentivize families to have children. And because of an improvement in healthcare, and frankly the high price of oil, they were able to improve their healthcare system to the point where they had reversed some of those catastrophic losses in male life expectancy. But how about this, the impact of the war on the men of childbearing age demographic? If we only take the conservative estimates of how many people have been killed and wounded, it's still in the six figures. It's over 100,000 and maybe significantly more than that. And then on top of that, you've got a couple of million people who've left. This is a demographic bomb that is going to have an impact long into the future. And a couple of interesting factors about that. One is that the Russians are just flat out lying about how many men have been killed in this war. You've got numbers that are estimates from European agencies, the United States military think tanks that put the figure of Russian losses over six figures. The Russians themselves say, what, it's about 20,000 or fewer. I think that even they are starting to acknowledge that the losses have been greater than that.
And what it's told us is that we can't trust virtually any of their statistical data these days. Pretty good bet that they are withholding or falsifying data, not just on demographic and social factors, but all across the economy, business output. There are reasons to suspect a lot of what we're seeing. In terms of the exodus of people, that's been coming in waves for quite some time. There's been a huge exodus of the creative class from Russia, really for more than a decade, as the political winds started to shift back in 2011, 2012, 2013. You had lots of people who just decided that they couldn't tolerate the increasingly repressive political and social environment, and so a lot of Russia's best and brightest, the economists, the poets, the authors, the entrepreneurs, the people who should have formed the foundation of the kind of modern entrepreneurial economy that Russia should have been building, they were already leaving. And then in the build-up to the war and when the war started, hundreds of thousands more.
Well, that certainly did happen. Judy, I'd like to maybe contradict or just contrast a little bit with what I saw in Russia. I was there from 2015 to 19, and there was a strong entrepreneurial class there, but they knew what they could focus on and what they couldn't focus on. I'm sure you have lots of friends who were academics and working in Russia, but even then, even in the social sciences, if they wanted to publish abroad, they had to get permission, which is crazy to think about if you're used to an American academic environment. But in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in the big cities where the digital economy is really getting going, there seemed to be an unwritten compact between the Kremlin and these really bright entrepreneurial people. And that was, look, we're not going to pay attention to the news. We're not really going to dig into what it is that you're doing with regard to our personal freedoms, because frankly, we like the life that we have now. We're making a nice salary, we live in a nice apartment, I get 2 vacations a year, I've got a nice car. So that compact where you leave me alone to live my very comfortable life, and I won't protest in the streets. And when people wonder why there hasn't been an intellectual uprising against the Kremlin, it's because Putin did what the Soviets didn't do. If somebody was unsatisfied with the government in Russia during the 60s and 70s and 80s, they talked to their friends, they built pressure for change. But as far as Putin's concerned, there's the door. If you want to leave, you can go. So there never was that pressure cooker that there seemed to be at the end of the Soviet period. But when the war started, and even more so when word of mobilization went out, all of these people who thought that they had this deal with the Kremlin where they could have their comfortable lives, where they could live wherever they were and still take holidays and be perceived by their friends in the West as normal, suddenly that was gone and they had to leave. And we read now about how countries like Georgia, Armenia, even Kyrgyzstan are being changed. Any place that Russians could go to without a visa, they went and they flooded there. These are digital nomads. These are people who are being successful, and they're changing the societies where they're now living. Places where Russians used to go once a year, like to the beaches of Antalya in Turkey, are now Russian communities with schools and cultural centers.
And there are some weird dynamics happening in some beach resorts in various places around the world where you have Ukrainian war refugees and Russian expats living in these sort of resort complexes that have shared workspaces, co-working environments, and they sort of uneasily coexist side by side. It's a weird dynamic that emerges in some of these spots.
It's got to be strange. And one of the things that makes it strange is the two communities have their own very separate understandings of what is actually happening and why it's happening. And the ability of Moscow to control the narrative within Russia is just extraordinary. And yes, the use of repressive tools, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Great Terror of the 1930s, is extraordinary, but you don't see people protesting against that or resisting that, probably because they fear being sent to prison for it. But you're not allowed to speak out against the war. You're not allowed to question the Kremlin's narrative, and anybody who does that is subject to arrest and to long imprisonment, seizure of their assets, and making it impossible for their families to thrive. So it's tough.
And yet if you go to Moscow or St. Petersburg now, one of the large modern cities, from what I understand from the few friends that I have left in those places, you wouldn't know there's a war happening, other than the occasional, big war emblem Z on a billboard here and there.
Right.
It's as if it's
And
business as usual.
displacement of a lot of the products that Russians have gotten used to. I know that when sanctions went up while I was there, suddenly things that were normally available on shelves were just gone. But before long, people learned how to live without them. But you're right. One of the first things that the Biden administration talked about after sanctions were imposed was how they expected the Russian economy to fall apart. And in fact, there were some indications that the sanctions were going to hit hard. Russia's ruble lost a huge component of its value initially, but all that's come back. And it's come back, unfortunately, in some part due to the West's continued dependence on Russia's energy. Despite the fact that Western Europe was doing a very good job of trying to move towards renewable energy, they continue to import Russian energy. And Germany, despite the fact that it is such a strong supporter of Ukraine, continues to send cold hard cash back to Russia to pay for the energy that it's importing. And this money is being used to sustain Russia's currency and to sustain its own war effort. And unfortunately, until we can be ready to absorb the political cost of these economic decisions, Russia is going to continue to be able to fund its war effort. But I've been talking a lot about Western Europe. It's not all Western Europe that is supporting Russia or doesn't want to be part of the Western effort against Russia. Places like Hungary and Serbia are actively importing Russian gas and are getting very generous benefits and deals from the Russian energy giant Gazprom in order to sustain their own economies. And some of those countries are on-selling that gas to other countries and making a lot of money on it because they're benefiting from their special relationship with Russia. But much more importantly are Russia's relations with India and China. And India and China are huge customers of Russian energy and other Russian raw materials. And their response has been very different. The one thing that I've noticed, and I think we've all noticed about how China has engaged with Russia, is that they've been supportive of Russia up to a point, but anytime Putin has used some of his rhetoric about the potential for nuclear war, China's leaders come in very quickly and say, no, no, that's not happening. So China's recognition that Russia is going to pursue this war is important, but China setting limits on Russia doing this, because as far as China is concerned, China's economic growth and China's own ability to continue to ascend as a world power is more important than Russia's objectives in Ukraine. And because China has this massive leverage on Russia, I think that one of the limits on Russia's behavior is going to continue to be how China views it. But another completely different way of approaching this has been how India's government has seen this. And they have expressed their frustration at the Eurocentrism of a lot of world leaders. And India's foreign minister said it so plainly as to say that, look, every time Europe has a problem, it's a world problem. But every time the world has a problem, it's not Europe's problem. So yeah, we're going to continue this relationship with Russia with regard to energy. They put limits on things. They recognize their partnerships with the West are long-term partnerships. But they also are frustrated that we expect India to pay an economic price for things that are happening in Europe. And I do understand that for India to sustain its own growth and to sustain its own very important economy, they need access to energy, and they can't pay the prices that it would cost if sanctions were imposed.
You mentioned India, China, a lot of other countries being beholden to Russia because of the energy and raw materials. Does Russia have anything else economically, industrially to offer the rest of the world?
Well, let's not underestimate the value of these raw materials. I mean, they're extraordinary. And that was one of the things that we learned very early on when we put sanctions against Russia for murdering people in the United Kingdom. We sanctioned Oleg Deripaska and Rusal, this giant aluminum company and producer, thinking that we would hit an oligarch close to Putin. But we got calls from Dearborn, Michigan, Ford Motor Company, saying, wait a minute, we use Russian aluminum to make the F-150. How come you guys didn't tell us this was coming? Why didn't you give us a chance to talk about this? And we got a bunch of other calls as well, but the one from Dearborn was the one we took first. So let's not underestimate just how valuable Russia's energy and raw materials are to the global economy. Russia has the ability to export instability. It's much cheaper to tear down than it is to build. And Russia's ability to wage conventional war has been shown to be very much less than what we had feared, what they had projected. But its ability to inflict instability by using its intelligence services, by cyber warfare and things like that are still very significant, and we have to worry about that more than we would have. But one of the big things that the world has learned from Ukraine's heroic defense is that Russia's military is not what we expect it to be at all.
We have a question from one of the students.
Yeah. So I had a couple questions. So with regards to the demographic issue, in the last 10 years or so, we've seen Russia enact these anti-gay policies. We've seen calls for anti-abortion policies within Russian parliament. How much of these social policies is tied to that demographic crisis and Russia's desperation to get more families to produce more children?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And in terms of Russia's rhetoric, they definitely try to put it all in one basket, right? Yeah. And have it all tied together. But for me, and I'll turn to Ambassador Godfrey in just a moment, for me, the anti-abortion policies, the anti-gay policies and legislation, and a whole other package of hard conservative-leaning policies that are all wrapped up in a broad move toward social conservatism that is part of Putin's anti-Western agenda. He wants to paint Russia as a unique global alternative to what he portrays as a decadent, destined to fail because of its decadence West. And so that's really where I think all of this is rooted.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. When I was in Russia, and when you've been there as well, when we engage with people who are trying to advance individual rights as we understand them in the West, not just the United States, but all over the West, and to advance individual rights as Russia has actually agreed in international organizations, they say that they're all under attack because they want to be tarred with the same brush. All of these people represent values that are not true to Russia. And the three components of the old Russian Empire, that is, the state, the leader, and the church, are the ones that they want to advance. Unfortunately, the Russian Orthodox Church has been entirely co-opted by the Kremlin, and unfortunately, it's something that is going to tar its reputation for a long time coming. One of the things that Russians struggle with, though, in this conservative mindset that they are trying to create and support, is an anti-Muslim component, which is contradictory for Russia, because there are 20 million Muslims in the Russian Federation, and the demographic bomb that has gone off in the northern part of Russia is not going off the same way in the southern part of Russia, where many of these folks live. So as you see more xenophobia, you also see more anti-Muslim and anti-everything action. Sure.
Are they also like, if I remember correctly, the Russian government also relies on Kadyrov in Chechnya, and their government is heavily has heavy like religious fundamentalist elements, and Russia is kind of dependent on this Islamic fundamentalist government, because if they get rid of them, they'll return to the 90s where it was a civil war in Chechnya.
Right. Well, you happen to know the only guy in the U.S. government who was living in Chechnya at that time. So I was living in Chechnya between the two wars when Ramzan Kadyrov's father, Ahmad, was first Mufti of Chechnya, and then later president of Chechnya with Moscow's blessing. It's not really Islamic fundamentalism that drives the relationship between Moscow and Grozny. It's cash. It's straight up cash. When after the second Chechnya war, Grozny was absolutely flattened. Moscow rebuilt it and it installed first Ahmad Kadyrov and then his son Ramzan. And in return for this rebuilding and giving Ramzan Kadyrov total control of the Republic of Chechnya, not just the region of Chechnya, Chechnya gives Putin absolute loyalty. And if that means sending a Chechen brigade to Syria to help Assad, yes, I'll do that. If that means sending Chechen brigades to fight alongside Russian troops and private military companies in Ukraine, then they'll do that as well. Okay.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about how a lot of these Western European nations that rely on Russia's gas and oil and energy, but they're indirectly supporting Russia in their fight by funneling them money for the energy. Why is, and I know you were talking about how India couldn't really bear the economic burden of supporting these Western nations, but why hasn't a country like America or another European nation or a group of nations tried to work together in kind of cutting off this economic chokehold Russia has over these Western nations?
Yeah, like how are they doing in Dearborn?
Yeah, well, it's tough. It's not easy. From the standpoint of somebody who has worked on sanctions and trying to sustain sanctions or consensus for sanctions over an extended period of time, it's going actually a lot better this time than it has in the past. It really is. But what we would need to do is to provide an alternative supply of energy. And just like the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, the best time to have natural gas regasification ports and infrastructure is also 20 years ago. It's expensive, it's hard to do. We're working on it, but we're not done. And there isn't an alternative that is entirely viable yet. But all of the other pathways that were sort of getting started and being argued about and moving slowly, they are really moving fast now. The pathway for gas from the Caspian to get to Europe was something that was entirely theoretical just 2 years ago. Now, the Trans-Adriatic pipeline is going to be delivering gas from Azerbaijan, from Greece across and into Italy, and that's happening.
What's Russia's rebuke that? They probably know that where the countries are trying to redirect the way they get energy, but what is Russia going to do about that, you think?
I think that goes back to your first question, why now?
Mm-hmm.
The why now? This is the moment of his greatest leverage. He knew that he was going to be losing this leverage if he didn't act now. So that's why he did. He didn't expect this to go on this long.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't expect the Germans to be able to tighten their belts. He didn't expect Ukraine to be able to hang on this long. And it's just extraordinary, but it's happening. We're watching it. We're watching it from the sidelines, and maybe that gets into the other topic that you raised. How is it that we are supporting militarily? What we should be doing more, and what are the limits on that? And are we going past the limits that we set? That's a really tough question. The Biden administration made clear from the very beginning that it did not want the U.S. To take steps which would be considered by Russia as acts of war against Russia. The United States didn't want NATO to be in the fight. NATO could support the fight, but shouldn't be in the fight. But now, as time has gone on, the United States has taken steps that at the beginning I don't think we would have taken. Supplying tanks to Ukraine. Cynics would say that it's going to be a long time before there's an M1A1 Abrams tank in Ukraine, but the United States decision to supply tanks gave top cover to Europeans who could get tanks there faster. But is that going to be considered the step that Putin sees as one too many and starts opening up his target book for other places? I'm not exactly sure. The one thing I know is that the people who are fighting this war are in need of our help, and what the United States and Europe are doing is unprecedented. In Russia, though, and it's important that everybody understands this, this is not being called a war of Russia against Ukraine. This is being called a war of Russia defending itself against NATO's aggression. Russia defending itself against the rise of neo-Nazism. The narrative in Moscow, crazy as though it sounds to people who don't live there, is that NATO is attacking Russia, and that Moscow is heroically standing up to this horrible aggression.
And it's stunning how pervasive the uptake of that narrative is, even among people who you would think would know better. You know, friends, colleagues, people who have interacted with Western partners for decades.
Yeah, and
seem to be doing more than just paying the required lip service to this narrative.
It used to be, when I was working in Russia, when you would have a conversation with somebody, they would read off their official government talking points, and then you could have a real conversation about what was going on. the way things were, we perceived reality the same way. White was white, blue was blue. But then, this most recent time I was living in Russia, people were busy. They had not so much time to educate themselves well. And they would do what everybody does. They get home from work, they turn on the television, they watch 15 minutes of the news. At first they said, no, that news is all bullshit, I don't have to listen to it. But this is the only source of information that they have. They would have to work hard. This is back before there were restrictions on the internet. They would have to work hard to educate themselves. And people were tired, they had families, they had jobs, they had stuff to do. So they began to have their worldview shaped by this propaganda. And now that it's illegal to download the New York Times, now that it's illegal to send a text message to a friend saying, what the hell's going on with this war in Ukraine, people have lost the ability to educate themselves, and now there are powerful disincentives to try and understand what's actually happening. And although, speaking of uptake, the number of downloads of VPNs in Russia has risen extraordinarily, it's still not enough to combat this powerful machine that the Kremlin has rebuilt. This is not a new machine. This existed in the 1930s and in the 1950s again, to control information and to control education and to control how people talk about things in the news.
No question.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the discussion of energy. You mentioned Azerbaijan at the pipeline. Other countries that produce oil and gas at like high rates, how are they generally reacting to the invasion? Do they see like this as a benefit to them? For example, like Azerbaijan benefited because the EU signed a deal with them instead of Russia.
Well, you've opened up a very complicated topic, and it's one I enjoy talking about. So it's a great question. If you want to talk about straight benefit, yes, Azerbaijan is one of the countries that has benefited. It had already been exporting oil through the Caspian pipeline, and the price of that oil has benefited from the war as well. They're not the only ones who have benefited. Saudi Arabia has benefited significantly from the higher oil prices. And Saudi Arabia has also resisted Washington's encouragement to increase production so as to make energy more affordable for the rest of the world, so as to soften the blow of the sanctions against Russia. But it hasn't. It hasn't. It's benefiting significantly. I wouldn't read too much into the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I think the lessening of tensions in that region is always a good thing, especially the horrible proxy war that had been going on in Yemen. But I think that there are a lot of countries who've benefited from the higher energy prices that have come out of this war. It's my hope, though, that this is going to be short-lived, and I think all of us probably hope that this has advanced the process of moving to renewables by years, not weeks and months, but by years.
I was also going to say, do you think, I guess, like in the long term, that we are this is good for like transitioning to renewables, or even a resurgence in nuclear, potentially?
You get into a complicated area when you talk about nuclear power. I'm a very strong proponent of nuclear power, and the United States government is officially so as well. But that's not how some nations view it after Fukushima. And for our political scientists, and I know there are some in here, the power of a single issue minority becomes really obvious. Germany's Greens have the key to the parliament, and they're going to be able to force that policy. For me, my personal experience in Serbia, Serbia produces 70% of its power through lignite coal, the dirtiest kind that there is. And the life expectancy of Serbians is a full year less than it would be if they weren't producing energy that way. They want to get to renewables, but the fastest way to reduce carbon emissions is to stop burning lignite coal and to burn natural gas while you're moving to renewables. That's off the table now for not just Serbia, but for all the countries of the Balkans who have this large deposit of the dirtiest coal. One of the things that you can do is bring up on the air quality app, and you'll see that Sarajevo is worse than Karachi, and that's pretty bad. But I hope, though, that other countries who have the ability to produce natural gas and move it around the world will invest in that. It's expensive to make those investments. And if you're a company driven only by your stockholders, why would you make a long-term investment in something that you know is not going to be needed? Because the expectation is that renewables are going to be the way to go. We have done some stuff, though. Near Thessaloniki in Greece, there's a new natural gas terminal where suddenly liquid natural gas from Louisiana is economically competitive with gas that's coming out of a pipeline from Russia. That's a good step, and that was a big investment. But again, there was a lot of government involvement in that. It's not going to be private companies doing that. A great question. Yeah.
Yeah. Going back to the censorship and like propaganda aspect of it, how big exactly is like the opposition to the war in Russia, and how effective has Putin been in like suppressing this like resistance to the war?
Yeah, it's the question as how big was the opposition 5 years ago and how big is the opposition now. I mean, that's one of the saddest things about what's going on in Russia. A lot of the people have left. The people that Dr. Twigg and I were talking about have left. Those are the people who are the most vocal. Some of the most respected, globally respected media outlets have been banned. Their people have been put in jail. The recipient of the Nobel Prize, the editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta, has had to close his operation down because it was declared illegal. And many of the people that I engaged with, social scientists, polling agencies, who would dare to actually try and find out the truth, these are people who are now in fear for their liberty. Some of them are in jail already. Alexei Navalny, who refused to meet with any Western embassies because he didn't want to give the Kremlin the ability to say, aha, he's a stooge of the West. He's in jail. He's the most vocal and the most likely leader of Russia's opposition to actually have an impact. But the ability of the Kremlin to control the narrative across the country is just extraordinary. I didn't expect it 2022 to be able to manage that as effectively as they have. And as a professional cynic, they did it with money. The woman who's the head of RT, Margarita Simonian, very intelligent person. I've had lovely conversations with her, but she is one of the people who's spewing the most vitriol against the Nazi, gay-loving West of anybody. Obviously, I can't have a conversation with her now, and I wouldn't want to anyways, but it's all about money for her. She actually has a Bentley. I mean, journalists aren't supposed to have that kind of stuff. It's crazy. Other questions? Дорогие товарищи.
We've got time. Okay, so I want to circle back to 40 minutes ago when you said that Putin's actions, you know, his theory of the case here was that he needed to start this war because he wanted to be able to continue to dominate energy markets. Well, that's turned out well, right? And it's produced an acceleration toward renewables that was unthinkable if the war hadn't happened.
Right.
He wanted to, he was assumed that the West would continue to be complacent in the face of his aggression because it had been in every previous instance. And now we see the Western coalition united again in ways that would have been unthinkable 13 months ago. What's his theory of victory? How does he think this turns out well for him? Given that he's achieved, not only has he not achieved these objectives, but he's produced dramatic reversals in Russia's position in his main policy.
That's the most frightening question that we're all asking ourselves right now, is where's his off-ramp?
Yeah.
How can he stop this? How can he do anything that is less than victory? One of the things that we were hoping he would do was maybe stop by declaring Donetsk and Luhansk as parts of the Russian Federation, and that would be where he stopped. The challenge to that is that a fight stops when both parties stop fighting, and what Russia has done to Ukraine is so unforgivable to the Ukrainians that they could never accept a compromise like that. So when we think maybe it'd be a good idea if we could just freeze things in place for a while, that's not how the Ukrainians see it. They are more than angry, and they have a righteous desire for not just defense, but for revenge. So that's going to be one of the things that the West will have to deal with if we come to a place where there can be an actual conversation. Ukraine gets a vote. It's the one that has been in this fight all along, so it's going to be really challenging. But how does Putin see victory from this? The way he's defined it, in terms of Russia's actions in World War II, is that it has to be an actual military victory. And I can't see that happening. So where do we move from here? How do we get to a place where this conflict doesn't escalate? How do we get to a place where we can walk things back? The challenge is that with Vladimir Putin as president of the Russian Federation, I'm not sure we have a way forward. And then, as you were asking, I'm sure that the question that was behind your question is, how come the Russian voters put up with this crap? Is that there's no rational connection between Putin's failures and his political failure. It just hasn't been connected for years now. And expecting there to be political consequences for failure in Russia is a mistake. we've made that mistake in the past. The other challenge that the West has is that we measure things differently than the Russians do. We in the United States value human life more than Russia's leaders value the lives of Russia's citizens. That has been the case for a long time. Russia's strategy in Stalingrad was to send more and more and more men to their certain death because they knew that they could overcome the German Sixth Army if they just kept on sending people, because the Germans just didn't have the capacity to face that.
And it worked.
And it worked. It worked. It was extraordinary. And Putin's mindset was set then, and his grand isolation for so long has unfortunately separated him. This is, again, speculation. This is somebody who hasn't watched or spent time with Putin lately. But his isolation from reality, I think, has led him to make some of these decisions that he now can't get out of. The Wagner Group and Prigozhin, the people that you hear about in the papers, are able to get to Putin to talk about how strong they are. But are people able to get to Putin to give him the information, the real information of what's going on in the battlefield? It's not clear to me. He's not a fool. He's not stupid. He's very bright. He's just ideologically committed and completely separated from the consequences of his own decisions.
So you said a minute ago that the off-ramp is hard to conceive while Putin is president. And I know early in the war, a lot of us were thinking that Russia's failures in the war would lead to that the solution would be a change in regime in Russia. That looks less likely, given
I think you're right.
Everything you've just described. What are the scenarios for an alternate leadership structure?
Right. So one of the mistakes that we made, and you just acknowledged we made it, was applying our values to the Russian environment, assuming that the cost of catastrophic failure in Ukraine on the battlefield would have political consequences for Russia's political leadership. We've been shown that those two things are completely separate, and now we all, experts on Russia and people who've been following this for decades, are acknowledging that the limits on Putin's grip on power are just not what we thought they were. Economic collapse won't lead to his losing power. Military defeat has not yet brought that about. The people that he has surrounded himself with and the people that he has empowered by giving them access to state companies, state resources, are all entirely dependent on him. They don't have independent bases of wealth or power. All of that power comes from the Kremlin's decision to grant them access to that power and to that wealth. So without that center, their wealth and power goes as well. So will there be a group of people who band together and say, no, that's enough? We've got to find a place for him to go. He's got to step down and step away. I don't see it now, and I'm looking. And I know that our intelligence people are looking, and we're trying to engage with as many people as we can. But the only feasible alternatives to Putin's leadership are people that are entirely beholden to Putin. So what people like me and the people I talk to about Russia are reduced to is say, okay, so the next leader of Russia, not Putin, but the next one is probably going to be very Putin-like, but the one after that, now that might be somebody who would take a different direction. But I don't see it happening.
And Putin has been almost Stalin-esque in deliberately making sure that no one plausible alternative develops. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And even 5 years ago, the fellow who's now and still defense minister was seen as a potential alternative. Not anymore.
Not anymore. Yeah.
Not anymore. He's gone. And some of the economists that were getting a little bit too big have had their wealth taken away because it is all dependent on him. Some of the other people who are really, really competent have always decided not to stick their heads up above the parapet. Even people like the extraordinary mayor of Moscow never wants to talk about anything on a national stage. And, it's an interesting set of problems. Anyway, one of the problems that I've had when talking about Russia with people who understand it, and you come to this point in the conversation when things are obviously bleak and are going to be bleak for a while, we look at our cups and we say, why are we drinking coffee? If that's the problem, we should be drinking something else. And I don't know, it's hard to not despair when you look at the situation now. But I see that at some point in the future, Russia is going to be different. It's an extraordinary culture. It's a beautiful place, and it's got an awful lot of natural wealth. So it's my expectation that at some point in the future it's going to be different. But just how we get from where we are right now to there is something I don't understand. Then I've said the same thing about Iran. I mean, there's this incredibly rich history, culture where learning is respected. I expect that they will be a leader in the region. And just how we get there from where we are right now, I don't understand. But who knows?
It's really depressing to think that, you know, that there was this, what, 10 or 15 years that will turn out to have been this massive aberration. Yeah.
Right.
There's another question.
Yeah, so related to Putin, at the beginning of the war, and we've seen this throughout the war, but at the beginning of the war, I had heard speculation about Putin's health. He is at this point 70 years old, and there's a lot of people speculating that he has Parkinson's, and more recently, some people have said he might have cancer. How credible are these, and how do you think like this would affect his decision making? That if Putin's like, you know, if I'm going to die pretty soon, I want to leave my legacy. Right.
Well, it's a great question, and yeah, everybody is engaged in that speculation. There was a meeting where Putin was clearly uncomfortable moving his feet around, and I regret to inform you that that may just be he needed to go to the bathroom as a consequence of the aging male physiology. It just might have been that. But the other part of your question is really interesting, the legacy part. He's been focused on that anyway. He wants to return Russia to what he thinks it should have been. He thinks the greatest calamity in Russia's history is the breakup of the Soviet Union. Individual nations' freedoms are not important to him.
Does he see himself sort of like in the vein as like when you think of Russia, you'll think like Peter the Great,
Absolutely
Stalin,
he does.
Putin.
He expects that there will be statues to him. I mean, this is crazy as it sounds. That's absolutely so. But on health stuff, he's very healthy. He's very fit, and there's a lot that can be done with the very best medicine. So nobody should count on that being an exit. I know that when President Biden was Vice President Biden, and I traveled with him to Turkey to meet with President Erdogan. Everybody was saying, oh, he just had terrible surgery, he's probably going to live 2 or 3 years. It was a long time ago, and it's still Erdogan in Turkey. You should never expect something like that to, can't, that's hope, that's not a policy.
How big of a reason is his legacy and like wanting to rebuild the Soviet Union kind of factor into like why he decided to invade Ukraine in the first place? Like, could that be like the main reason, or is that just like, you know?
In my view, that's totally the main reason.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you agree?
Yeah, and I mean, Ukraine has a very special place in that line of thinking, but I think it is a broader line of thinking. So when Ambassador Godfrey was talking earlier about the extent to which the Ukrainians will not accept a negotiated settlement, that they want every inch of their occupied land back, what they'll say is, because if we let him keep even a little, he'll stop for now, but he'll just come back for more in another couple of years. And Poland, the Baltics, all soundly agree with that.
They really
so
do.
Where will he stop if he gets away with this? I think it's a legitimate question.
Right.
How, because I've heard this, I know Ukrainians hate this phrase, but I've heard this idea in Russia, Ukraine is seen as this brotherly nation. And obviously to Ukrainians and to Belarusian opposition and other people who hear this, this is complete garbage. But how does this line of thinking, I think, relate to Putin's mindset and the mindset of these Russian imperialists?
Maybe I should ask Jordan to answer this, because we're studying this in our class right now. But in Moscow, they are trying to make the case that there is no separate nation. It is one nation. It is Rus. It is one Rus.
One Slav.
And nobody else thinks that. And not the Ukrainians, not the Belarusians. Well, the Belarusians will play with the idea, but the Ukrainians won't. This idea that Ukraine shouldn't be a separate country, it was never a separate country, first of all, is wrong, and second of all, it's not up to Moscow to decide. It's important to the entire world, to the international community, to international law, that one country doesn't get to decide that that other country shouldn't exist and should be part of it anymore. It's an important component, and that's one of the reasons why there's been so much consensus against this. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. And hello to students who will catch up with us a little bit later. I will figure out some other compensation for those who could answer questions about what Dr. Twigg was saying about demographics.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.